Hello guys, and welcome back to the HJW Gaming channel and a continuation of my commander guide, this time taking a deep look into Isildur. Isildur is an excellent tier 3 commander with his skill kit offering a variety of different bonuses such as unit buffs for elves and men, excellent damage mitigation, crowd control through madness, and also enemy debuffs. So as you'd expect with so many different options, many people have different favoured builds, but here I'm going to show you my couple of different favoured builds, whether you have his unique item or not, to get the most out of your Isildur. I really hope you enjoy the video. Now, to gain respect on Isildur, you have to gain the item Bark of the White Tree, which is of course a tier 3 respect item. The game lists Isildur's role as a leader, which means that at level 20 you get a bonus 5 command for Isildur's army. He's also listed as an all-around commander, so can lead all types of units well, though I'm not too sure I agree with that. But he also has control, meaning that he does carry some control skills. If you look at his stats, he is primarily focused towards might, with 92 base might, though he does also have pretty decent speed at 85. He lacks a little bit in the focus department, but all of these builds will focus on army physical damage, so might is where you want to be looking. Focus doesn't matter too much, except for a little bit of damage mitigation. Now his unique item, which is of course Narsil, is possibly one of the best unique items available in the game. It offers, as I said, bonus might, which is excellent for increasing the physical damage given by your army. It also offers a huge amount of bonus attack for men and elves. This goes up to +6 when it's fully strengthened, but it also offers a huge amount of bonus HP as well for the Ranger, Dunedain and Ranger of the North units. This is particularly useful as both the Ranger and the Dunedain units do tend to be a little bit squishy whilst having very strong damage output, particularly high damage output when combined with some of the builds which you can give to Isildur. This bonus HP almost completely changes the build that you would use for Isildur, as it makes the tier 2 Ranger and the Dunedain significantly more viable for use within his builds. The unique ability, Sun and Moon Splendour, actually has 2 different effects depending on your army composition. And this is why I don't really think he's an all-around commander, more focused on leading men and elves. If your army consists of only men, you get a 90% chance for the target to succumb to madness after each commander normal attack. It'll only last 1 round, but it's unlikely you're going to be using only men. So therefore the second ability is more relevant, and what this gives you is a 90% chance to remove a buff from the target when your army is comprised of men and elves. So these buffs could include, say, damage bonuses or damage received buffs as well. So you can inflict a little bit more damage. And in general, this is just a very, very strong effect, particularly when you combine that with the bonus attack and HP you're getting from the weapon itself. Now, looking into what gear I'd recommend equipping your Isildur with, beginning with the Exquisite gear. You'll note that a few of the different items are marked in squared brackets with, say, ranged build or unique build. That's because I'd only recommend this gear if you're using one of the specific builds that I mentioned later on, as I do have 3 different builds upcoming based around whether you use his unique item Narsil or not, so just take that into account. Now, his Exquisite gear is primarily focused around increasing range damage. So weapon-wise, we have the Mirkwood bow with the ranged might buff. The reason for that is you get the +3 attack on your ranged units, and you also gain +9% bonus damage as well for your ranged units. Chest piece wise, you have a couple of different options. The Hunter's Skin with ranged Vigour can be very good, as it provides bonus defense to your ranged units, and also damage received buff as well to your ranged units. But I'd only recommend this on the ranged build, as the other 2 builds focused around the unique item Narsil do not use as many ranged units. 2 other good options are also the Quilted Armour with focus protection if you're facing good side, and the Superior Hauberk with fire protection if you're facing off against evil side. That's so you can focus against some of the most common meta commanders from both sides, with good side commonly using commanders such as Gandalf the White in particular, but also Galadriel, and an evil side, of course, Witch Kings are almost, never not seen. So having fire protection can make you more resistant against those alchemist bombs in the early rounds. Headgear wise, we're looking primarily at the Trapper's Hood, so you get that +3 attack on your ranged units, as well as inflicting some madness through Hysteria, which can trigger some bonus damage from one of his sub-skills, as you'll see later on. Hysteria again can be a good choice on the Bone Mask as well, because that way you get +3 HP instead of the +3 attack, but personally I prefer the Trapper's Hood. And again, a Horseman's Helm with either Resolve or Warding can be useful, because even though we don't use mounted units, just the ability to completely shrug off stuns or madness can be very useful as well. And lastly, for accessories, we've got the Wizard's Firework. Again, for that bonus range damage, if you go for ranged might, you gain additional plus damage to your ranged units, though Hunter's Mark can be very valuable as well, particularly against good side, where you find a lot of avoidance in common heroes such as Gandalf the Grey and Gil-galad as well. So this gear is designed primarily with the ranged build in mind to boost the damage of your ranged troops. Using this combination, you gain a massive +9 attack with a possible +18% damage for your ranged units from the buffs as well, along with Hysteria triggering the Enfeeble skill, which can give you an additional round of +40% damage. All in, it makes Isildur's ranged unit damage absolutely enormous when combined with his other skills, but using some of the staple items such as the helms or the chests to counter against specific commanders are not a bad decision either. Flawless gear wise, we're going to look pretty similarly as far as gear goes. If you're still using the ranged build because you don't have access to Narsil, you're going to want to use the Gigantic Hammer, and that's with Rend. So the Gigantic Hammer can grant you +6 attack, which is again more of course than the Mirkwood Bow, and also Rend means they can ignore a portion of the opponent's defense, so you just gain a nice big boost of damage again. If you do have access to Narsil, of course, use that and then change your build up accordingly to one of the two builds I'm going to recommend later that are focused around using Narsil, as it is one of the best tier 3 items available in the game. Chest piece wise, we have a couple of different options. My personal favourite is the Ranger's Shroud with Resistance if you're using the ranged build. The reason for this is the Ranger's Shroud grants you that additional +3 attack, which you don't often see from a chest piece, and also Resistance can gain you some additional protection from fire and focus damage as well. But it can be a good decision if you're using Narsil to instead go with a Mithril Coat with Tactical Manoeuvres, as this provides an enormous amount of bonus defense for your units, as well as the Tactical Manoeuvres buff offering a massive amount of additional damage mitigation. A Plate of the Citadel also isn't the worst decision, but personally I prefer the Mithril Coat with Tactical Manoeuvres. Helm wise, my best choice for both builds in my opinion is a Hunter's Guide with Aegis, though if you're using the Narsil build, a Cask of the Submerged Isle isn't a massive drop off in quality, of course with Aegis as well. What we want from this is that resistance to stuns and madness, just so there's no risk of you inflicting damage on your own troops via madness, or losing out on some of your early round damage buffs as a result of stuns. Hunter's Guide, of course, in the range build also offers +3 bonus attack, so that can be very valuable for increasing your damage output. Lastly, for accessories, I most like the Carved Dragon Tooth, as most people do, because it can offer up to a +6 bonus attack for all of your units, and comes with some magnificent buffs such as Tactical Mark, which is excellent against good side, so you can gain that pursuit to again face off against those Gil-galads or Gandalf the Greys, anything with high evasion. But Bane of Soldiers also is a very good choice, which increases your damage up against enemy melee units. With this flawless gear, you'll very much want to focus on which build you are going to use. If you have Narsil, make sure you're focused on gear for the unique build. If not, just focus on increasing your range damage as much as possible. Narsil completely changes up the build and the troops you're looking to use, so you're going to want to make sure to use the right gear. Now onwards onto troop synergy. Now Isildur has a number of troops that he can utilise to very good effect, so I'm just going to briefly try and cover a few of these now. The first of these I've kind of paired together, which is the Sentinel and the Tier 2 version of the Sentinel, which is the Marksman. These are extremely effective, high damaged, ranged units, which also have very good speed and bonus avoidance from their sub-skills, which can come in handy in providing a little bit more damage mitigation. But primarily you're looking to use these for their enormous damage output. Second up, we have another ranged unit, which is the Rohan-based archery unit, the Sharpshooter. These are excellent with Isildur as they synergise brilliantly with two of his skills, which are Great King and Coalition, to make them enormously high damage early round units to get you a nice boost early on in battles. So I definitely recommend using these, particularly in the ranged build. The next troop which synergises well with Isildur, though I don't see them used very often, particularly in roleplay, potentially due to the fact that they're hard to access due to them being in Linden territory, is the Keeper. This is an elven melee unit with very high damage due to inflicting up to 50% focus damage as well as its regular damage. These are extremely effective against monostack armies due to, again, an additional up to 50% from their unit buffs if the opponent's only using one troop compositions. It's also made all the more effective by Coalition, which gives them a high chance of initiative as well, so they can inflict this high damage before the opponents can damage them, because they have very low defense, so they can be lost very quickly. Fourth up in this list, we have another lesser seen unit, is the Ranger of the North, which is Arnor's Tier 4 unit. These synergise very well with the ranged build due to the protection they provide to the other ranged units, and they're made significantly more tanky by Isildur's damage mitigation skills. They can also be given excellent additional HP and follow-up by his Respect 3 skill. Fifth on this list, we have possibly the troop that synergises best with Isildur, and this is the Dunedain and its Tier 2, the Ranger. These are brilliant anti-range troops. They take less damage from ranged units and target enemy ranged units with bonus damage. They're made significantly more tanky by Isildur's damage mitigation, as well as additional bonus HP from Narsil if you choose to use it. And they're granted follow-up by the King of all the Dunedain, Isildur's Respect 3 skill tree. They're only really recommended though if you do have Narsil, as without that bonus 6 HP, they can be a little bit too squishy and have limited effectiveness. Last up on troop synergy, we have the Woes' Hunter, which is a final Tier 3 men ranged option. They're extremely effective due to having good damage and also dealing poison damage as well, along with similar synergies to the Sharpshooter with the Coalition skill. Speaking of skills, I'm first up just going to talk through each of his skill trees and what I think of each of these skills, because then I can, when I come to the skill builds, just talk about why I've chosen each of those select skills without having to explain each of their uses. So his top Respect 0 skill tree is a skill tree which is familiar to anyone who's ever used Frodo and Sam, and that is Ring Bearers. This skill grants you a 1.3% chance to evade physical damage each round, but your commander has a 25% chance of succumbing to madness. Now that 1.3% can become 20% once all 15 skill points are allocated, in which case Isildur also gains plus 15 focus. This isn't a particularly great skill a lot of the time, as of course you risk your commander being succumbed to madness, which then means some of his skills can be applied to the opponents instead of your own units, or also inflicting damage to your own units. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this skill a lot of the time. It tends to be used more on Frodo and Sam as kind of a gimmicky skill to evade damage whilst also inflicting madness through some of the sub-skills I'm going to talk through now. Starting with Ring of Terror. Now this means for the first 2 rounds against the enemy commander and units, so both of those, there's a 10% chance to inflict madness each round per skill point. So if you put 7 skill points into this, that chance is increased to 70%. When combined with the headline skill Ring Bearer, you can create somewhat of a gimmick where if you have a very minimal command troop composition, you can potentially avoid the first few rounds of damage whilst inflicting madness, and therefore making the opposing army inflict more damage to themselves than you can take on your own. But overall, I think this skill tree is very gimmicky, so I wouldn't recommend it used at all, to be honest. The other sub-skill is Elven Rope, which applies every 4th round and it inflicts one enemy target with a 3-round stun, but it's fairly low chance, increasing to 85% if you put 7 skill points in. But again, this is only going to inflict in rounds 4 and 8, so if you do get the hit, it's already quite late on, as it's not effective in the first 3 rounds, which are the most important rounds of combat. So yeah, overall, I think this Ring Bearer skill tree is not particularly effective, and I would not recommend using it. The same can't be said, however, for the bottom Respect 0 skill tree, which is Great King. Now this skill has a number of different effects. In the first round, it makes your enemy units deal minimal damage, which is again great. As I said, the first few rounds in combat, particularly the first round, are the most valuable. So if your units can output, high damage and your opponents are only inflicting minimal damage, you've already got an early advantage. But on top of that, from round 2 onwards, your allied units also get a damage buff, which lasts all the way up until round 5, the end of round 5. And when maximised, that damage buff is plus 21% damage. And additionally, you also get plus 20 might for Isildur himself. So this is an excellent skill that helps you increase your damage for the first half of your battle and also reduce the enemy damage in the first round. In the sub-skills of this bottom Respect 0 skill tree, we actually see more control skills focused around madness. The top sub-skill is Consequence of Greed, which in the first round, against enemy targets, so all enemy units, you get up to a 100% chance to inflict madness. This when all 7 skill points are inflicted. Additionally, the bottom sub-skill, Enfeeble, also means that against enemies that are subject to madness, you can inflict up to an additional 40% damage by inflicting the debuff on them. The combination of these 2 sub-skills, along with Great King, can be devastating in that first round, as the opponent's units will be, if you think about it, dealing minimal damage due to Great King, will also be inflicted with madness, so may not hit your troops, will hit their own, and on top of that, they're also receiving 40% more damage. So they could be dealing huge damage to themselves, and at the same time, your units inflicting huge damage upon them due to that Enfeeble buff. It basically gives you an enormous first round advantage. So I think this skill tree is very, very strong. Next up, we look at the Respect 3 skill tree. It begins with King of all the Dunedain. This skill is focused on 3 units in particular, the same 3 units as his unique item, the Ranger, the Dunedain, and the Ranger of the North. What it does is it gives them a 3% chance per skill point to gain follow-up. So once all 15 points are allocated, you gain a 45% chance of these units getting follow-up each turn. Now these units do deal very good damage, and also if you think about if you have their unique item, they'll also have a lot more survivability due to the bonus plus 6 HP if fully strengthened. So with follow-up dealing good damage and the bonus HP, and also when 15 skill points are allocated, these 3 units gain another bonus 3 HP. The combination of this can be really devastating and make these 3 units very, very tanky as well as deal a huge amount of damage. However, without the unique unit, I don't see as much value in this, as it's a less than 50% chance of follow-up, so it's not going to activate every round, more between 4 and 5 rounds of combat in total, and only getting plus 3 HP is not really enough if you don't have his unique item. So I'd only recommend using this skill to the max if you have Narsil and can get it up to a decent level of strengthening. For sub-skills under this line, there are also some very strong skills. The first of these is Dunedain Bloodline. Now this offers an attack bonus of plus 2 to all men units, and also a defense bonus of plus 5 per skill point for men units. Now if you keep increasing this skill all the way up to a maximum of 7, it is only the defense buff that rises. You don't get up to plus 14 attack, it stays at plus 2. And the second sub-skill is Champion of Light, which allows allied units to deal increased damage to Orc, Urukai and Troll units at 4% per skill point, up to a maximum of 28%. So this can be very strong against evil units and will particularly be prevalent in the against evil build. And the last skill tree, the Respect 5 skill tree, opens with Last Alliance. Now, Last Alliance will be Isildur's unit's main damage mitigation. If your army consists of both men and elves, for the next 7 instances of damage, you'll receive 6% less damage, which gradually decreases over time as you take more damage. Now, this 6% goes up per skill point, so of course with maximum skill points that goes to 90% damage mitigation for the first 7 instances of damage. On top of that, when maximised, your men also gain another plus 2 HP. So again, we're just stacking those defensive buffs on the men units. You also gain a plus 1 attack to your elven units, so you can deal a little bit more damage. Now, as I said, this is going to be Isildur's main damage mitigation. As this erodes gradually over time, but is effective right from the first round, of course, it's mostly effective in the beginning rounds of combat, which, as I've said, are the most important rounds of combat, so that you can gain an early troop numerical advantage in order to win over the duration of an entire battle. So this is really excellent damage mitigation. Under sub-skills, his top sub-skill is Coalition, which gives men a chance to deal highest damage and elves a chance to gain initiative. With all 7 skill points in, both of these chances are 75%. Coalition can be an excellent skill when you have men troops, as some of the men, particularly men ranged units, have a very high variance between their highest and lowest damage. Look at the sharpshooter, I believe there's a 13 damage range between them, which can have a huge effect. So making them always deal or 75% of the time deal their highest damage is a massive increase in damage output from that unit. And the bottom Respect 5 skill tree is Free Peoples, which is a flat damage received buff to men, elves, dwarves and hobbit units, though of course we'll be primarily looking at men and elves. And when 7 skill points are allocated, you can gain minus 14% damage received. So again, it's just a little bit more damage mitigation to keep your troops alive. So now that I've spoke through the various skills, let me look now at the various different builds that I would recommend. Beginning with a ranged build, which I would recommend always using if you do not have his unique item, Narsil. The reason I recommend this build is that without the additional HP and attack granted by Narsil, the Dunedain units are not as valuable, and the Ranger Tier 2 units are just way too squishy to even consider. Therefore, we're going to remove the focus away from them and the improvements on them, and instead utilise Isildur's Madness skills in the bottom Respect 0. From maximising the bottom Respect 0, we gain that bonus Madness and additional damage in that first round as a result of Consequence of Greed and Enfeeble, and we also gain that plus 21% damage up until round 5 as a result of Great King. We're still going to put 2 points in King of all the Dunedain, though the only reason we're doing this is so that we can put 1 point in Dunedain Bloodline. The reason we've chosen to do this is we want that plus 2 attack to all men units. And then we're also going to maximise the Respect 5 skill tree for that damage mitigation from Last Alliance and Free Peoples, and also maximise Coalition so that we can get that damage bonus, particularly the 75% chance to deal highest damage for men units. And then we're going to look to use an army that primarily focuses on men units as damage dealers. Of course, we'll also have 1 elven unit as we need that to trigger Last Alliance. So the troop composition I would recommend is 2700 Sentinels, the high damage elven ranged unit, 2700 Sharpshooters, which are the Rohan based archery unit, which usually have a mixed bag of damage, but of course with Coalition now also deal a very high amount of damage. And then for your third troop, I'd recommend 2600 Woes' Hunters. If you don't have access to these, you can use the tier 2 elven ranged unit, the Marksman, though the Woes' Hunters I would recommend more, as they'll gain that highest damage buff from Coalition as they are men units. The skilling order is not relevant for their activation, but if you're going to go through levelling up, I'd recommend focusing first on the Last Alliance skill tree if you have both men and elves available, so that you can get that early damage mitigation just to reduce your troop losses. Then I'd focus on Great King, and just the last few points can then go into King of all the Dunedain and Dunedain Bloodline. Now into the second build that I would recommend for Isildur, and this is if you do have Narsil and you're facing off against good side opponents. For this build, it's going to be pretty similar to the last one. However, we're going to take 7 points out of both of Enfeeble and Consequence of Greed, and instead increase King of all the Dunedain up to a maximum of 15 points. The reason we're choosing to do this is the additional HP and attack granted by Narsil significantly improves the Dunedain, Ranger and Ranger of the North units. When it's combined with the follow-up that you can get from King of all the Dunedain and the further damage bonuses granted by the R3 skill tree and Coalition, alongside the Respect 5 trees damage mitigation, you end up with some reasonably tanky units that are capable of outputting huge amounts of damage, particularly to ranged troop opponents, of which good side have very prevalently, because good side rely pretty much on ranged units for their damage output. So your use of Rangers and Dunedain heavily will massively counter against this. Troop composition wise, as you can see, we are again leaning very, very heavily on those Dunedain and Rangers. I'd recommend 3,500 Dunedain, 3,000 Rangers, and then 1,500 of either Heralds or Keepers. These Elven units, of course, are used in low volume, but we do need the Elves to trigger Last Alliance. If you're playing as Arnor, you can sub out those Rangers for a number of Rangers of the North, which are the tanky Tier 4 Arnor ranged unit. Again, skilling order isn't relevant for activation, though the priority order for levelling up is shown on screen. If you have your Isildur at very high respect, you can then put any remaining points into Consequence of Greed and Enfeeble to then get that additional feather in your cap of some madness and crowd control as well. And then you can also go to Dunedain Bloodline to gain some additional defense if your Isildur is a wildly high respect level, above respect level 20. Now into the last build, and this is going to be again a build focused around an Isildur that does have a highly strengthened Narsil, but this instead is going to be focused on when you're facing off against the evil side. This is almost exactly the same as the last build, but instead of having 7 points in Free Peoples under the Respect 5 skill tree, we'll sacrifice that 14% damage mitigation for Champion of Light, so we get that bonus 28% damage to Orcs, Urukai and Trolls, which are some of the most common units used by the evil side. So against most evil commanders, except for those that use evil men, you will have an enormous damage boost. When facing evil, it's very much recommended to use a helm that has either Aegis or a horseman's helm with warding, as you could find yourself being inflicted with madness, which is pretty prevalent amongst evil troops, such as Sauron and Grima, because you don't want to deal heavy damage to yourself and also waste your own damage mitigation buff from Last Alliance by inflicting instances of damage on yourself. So it's very much recommended to focus on avoiding that madness altogether if you can. Skill order wise is the same as the last two builds. If you do have any bonus skill points, I'd recommend first off going into Free Peoples so you can gain that additional damage mitigation, and then look into going to Enfeeble and Consequence of Greed. For troop composition, it's exactly the same again, so no change there from the unique build versus good or evil. Now let's just talk through matchups that can be very strong and matchups to avoid whilst using Isildur. The first good matchup I find to be universally good for both builds with Isildur are early round burst damage commanders, such as those that rely on the Convener skill, such as Elrond or Witch King, or other early round damage commanders such as Faramir. I find these to be a very good matchup for Isildur because a lot of his damage mitigation is focused on those early rounds, whilst also his damage buffs increase his damage against the opposition in those early rounds as well. Great King and Last Alliance will be a massive negative to the effectiveness of these early round damage commanders. So I think these are a very good matchup for Isildur. Secondly, if you're using the unique build, I find that a lot of the very meta good side commanders are also countered massively by Isildur. Commanders that rely on ranged units, such as Elrond, Gil-galad, or also even the ranged build of Isildur, fall really foul to the unique build of Isildur. The Dunedain and Rangers end up just shredding through the opposition ranged units whilst taking very minimal damage thanks to Isildur's damage mitigation and their own personal buffs against enemy ranged units. And lastly, I find that enemies that use single army compositions often can struggle up against Isildur. The reason for this being is that the strong damage mitigation from Last Alliance only fades after taking each instance of damage, so if the opposition is only using one troop in their army, they can only deal very few instances of damage, so the Last Alliance buff will last into the later rounds. Now into what matchups I would look to avoid. Eowyn, in particular with her unique item, can be a very difficult matchup for the ranged build in particular. This R10 accessory can reduce range damage taken by up to 30% for the first 4 rounds, by which point Isildur's damaged buff from Great King will have expired, and Eowyn of course will be dealing, or her troops rather, will be dealing a huge amount of damage to your own units. So this is a very poor matchup for the ranged build. Dunedain troop compositions of course also counter against the ranged build. As I've said, these Dunedains have massive buffs towards their damage received from ranged units and also their damage dealt, so the Dunedains can counter your ranged build Isildur massively, so look to avoid these where possible. Similarly, if you're facing off against evil side, Dragoons can also be a massive counter to the ranged build. They take less damage from ranged troops, so they work as excellent tanks. In addition, when facing off against evil, skills like Champion of Light do not affect up against Dragoons as they are an evil men troop. This means that some commanders such as Khaldun are extremely effective up against Isildur of all different builds, as Khaldun's damage mitigation, along with the fact that he uses evil men troops, makes him almost the perfect counter for facing off against Isildur. Similarly, when facing off against evil, again, particularly if you're using the ranged build, though still effective up against the verse evil build as well with Narsil, despite Champion of Light, I find Gorbag to be a difficult opponent. The reason for this is he has natural madness immunity through his Respect 5 skill tree, and he can inflict stuns and madness on your troops. And lastly, he also tends to use a lot of Reapers in his troop composition, and the Reaper skill means that they target your lowest defense unit, so they can take out a lot of your units very quickly, particularly your ranged units. Last but not least, I find the Mouth of Sauron to be very effective also up against Isildur. The reason for this is damage is debuffed for 3 rounds, which reduces the effectiveness of the Great King buff massively, and he can also inflict madness on 2 of your troops, meaning that you then use up your Last Alliance buff by hitting your own troops, if you do not have the Aegis helm or, of course, a warding horseman helm. And finally, he also uses Reapers a lot of the time, which can deal an enormous amount of damage to your ranged troops in particular because of their low defense. Now, I'm going to quickly just flash up, just for a minute, a couple of very strong battle reports. You'll see a few here. These, of course, are not exhaustive of his good matchups. It's just a showing of what he can do against some of the most meta commanders. Of course, Dwalin, Gil-galad and Theoden are commonly considered some of the best good side commanders. And then from the evil side, you also have Witch King and Sunind as well, being 2 of the most prevalent. In particular, the report at the top up against the Witch King is an Isildur using a Narsil build up against potentially one of the best Witch Kings I've ever faced, from Magnus, who I know is a watcher of this channel, and a big shout out to him for letting me use this report, as he really is a really strong player, fully refined gold gear, so it is a truly strong Witch King, and you can see how strong the Isildur was going through it there, losing less than half of its army. Now, just to summarise, I'm aware this has been quite a long video, so thank you if you're still sticking along with me. I'm just going to run through just a final summary of Isildur. and where his strengths and weaknesses lie, and any final conclusions. So his strengths lie in very strong damage mitigation, crowd control skills through madness, high damage buffs, a brilliant top tier respect 10 item, and the fact that he has beneficial skills all the way up to respect 25. Some of his weaknesses are that he can be vulnerable to stuns and madness. He suffers sometimes from range damage reduction, particularly if you're using the ranged build, and he can struggle against evasion, madness immunity, and or cleanse abilities. But overall, he's an excellent tier 3 commander with, despite having many different builds, you often see him being one of the most effective commanders on the battlefield. What he offers from his skill trees with damage mitigation, madness infliction, enemy debuffs for elves and men are just absolutely enormous. In particular, his damage mitigation is one of the strongest in the game in the early rounds, which allows you to use just extremely high damage units all the way through his army for very little cost. In my opinion, he's one of the best tier 3s in the game, so if you're looking for a tier 3 to invest in, Isildur would definitely be my recommendation. Quick shout out before I go that a lot of this guidance was given to me by a fellowship mate of mine called Gore. I've linked his Discord down in the description. It is one of the best Discords around if you're looking for commander guides for both RP and non-RP. So please go there and check him out. And with that, that's everything I have to offer. If you've enjoyed it, please smash the like button, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please consider hitting the subscribe button. I would massively appreciate it. And once you're done with this video, why not check out another? I recently posted a commander build guide for Aragorn King of Men as well, available in the end screen. Thank you once again for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.